So welcome back, everybody. My name is Jamie Pease. I'm the chairman of the security stream, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Julie Berg, who's going to take us for our next presentation. But before I hand over to Julie, just a couple of things. So, like I said, this is session 4BG for the purpose of feedback. Don't forget to do that, and again, I'll remind you at the end of this session to do that. It's important to us that you do leave your feedback. This session is being recorded, by the way. Do feel free to pop questions in the chat, or just raise your hand. Julie said she's more than happy to take questions, throughout. So, if needed, we can actually unmute your line. So just pop in the chat if you'd like your line unmuted. And Julie's presentation will actually be uploaded after this session, so you'll be able to actually go and download it from there. But without further ado, so Julie, this is, I believe, your first time to GSE?
Yes, it is.
Oh, and you're very welcome. And so just Julie and I used to work together back in our IBM days, so we know each other well. So without further ado, Julie, over to you. This wonderful topic, MFA, is kind of one of those, it's a no-brainer. Why are you not doing it? So over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to sit here and talk today. For those of you, and I heard there's a couple of people that might know me that are on the line, I'm located in Minnesota in the United States. And just so if everybody's dreading the weather, just so you know, we got 8 inches of snow 2 weeks ago. So, middle of October, we got 8 inches of snow. The good news is it's 60 degrees Fahrenheit here right now, so it has melted. I can't do the conversion to Celsius that fast, but it's probably like 10 or whatever. So it's kind of been crazy fall here in where I live in the United States. I'm really here to talk to you about MFA and kind of protecting your data and thinking about it as a holistic viewpoint that's out there. And one of the, hang on. So one of the things as part of this, and I heard I am the last session for the day, is just to talk, from the charity, for the GSE, the UK, the charity aspect of it. And, hopefully that you find it expands your knowledge. And if you consider the charity link that is there below for the 2020 charity for the GSE UK conference. I like the shout out, Jamie, or the hands. So what I really want to talk to you today is a little bit about authentication, which really is the beating heart of security. It's one of the components that are out there when you think about this, what's going on in your environment. And when you think about this, even from a business standpoint and, government, other industries across it, it really is becoming more and more regulated out there. You need to think about what you're doing to detect threats in your mission critical corporate information and applications. And so a couple of things we're going to talk about today is really talking about when you need to think about deploying mainframe or MFA and to stop hackers, protect your assets, using analytics and cognitive computing to help you detect vulnerabilities and look at exposures in your environment. And then just kind of start thinking about this from the cloud and the big data by extending your mainframe into those investment areas. But again, thinking about this from what am I going to do to detect threats and make sure I'm making sure my environment is secure. So let's talk a little bit about today's environment. So when you think about today's environment that's out there, employees reuse the same password. And when you look at this in various studies that have been out there, but they say 70% of employees are reusing their passwords at work. And that means, if you think about it, if a hacker gains access to your credentials out there for maybe one or more apps, that the chances are that they're likely to gain access to other apps, including ones with customer information that's out there. And when you really think about this, it even gets worse, is because the majority of people that reuse the passwords are using that for work and personal accounts out there. So if you think about a hacker gets an employee's information off of Facebook or LinkedIn or any of the other social medias that are out there, there's a good chance that they might be able to get some of that information and use that password within your environment. So, when you think about this, employees use easy to use hash passwords. When if you're going out there, there's a couple of websites that are out there that can actually, you can type in passwords, it'll tell you how long it's going to take to possibly break them. But when you think about it, a lot of it is if you have hard passwords, you have troubles remembering them. And, that's why you tend to pick simple passwords that are out there. And when you looked at some of this, an analysis of over 5 million leaked passwords showed that 10% of the people used one of the 25 worst passwords that were out there. 7% of the enterprise users had extremely weak passwords in another study. So it really only takes that one bad password that a hacker can find and infiltrate your environment. And then when you think about it, people don't keep their passwords safe. Even when people do better, but they often are storing them somewhere safe. Now I realize none of us are necessarily in the office, but how many times when you're in office, people would go, there's that sticky note underneath my laptop or something that had my passwords. So, you don't do it. Or now, granted, you may be at home and you may be writing them down, but again, you really don't want to do some of that. And when you looked at these even numbers that said, 65% of business managers recorded their passwords on a private document like a Post-it note. So again, when you think about this, it really is that you need to think about your passwords, what are you doing? Because a lot of it is insider breach from stolen or weak credentials that are out there. And that's really what criminals are looking at when they looked at from this. And, passwords really are that weakest links that's out there. And that's why it is continues to be that top target for people that are out there in the environment. So let's talk a little bit some more about this. So when you really think about this, is the complexity is going to continue to go out there. So when you think about our ever expanding connected environments out there, talking about the billions and the 22 billion items to secure, 33 billion personal data or stolen records that are out there, 6 trillion lost annually to cybercrime that's out there. So really, when you think about it, wherever, regardless of your location, your industry, your vertical, your company, you're really not immune to some of this potentially happening in your environment. And when you really think about it, there's a potential, they're estimating that by 2023, there's going to be 33 billion records stolen by cyber criminals that are out there. So what do you think about this from that standpoint? Is you really need to think about this from a compliance aspect and ever-changing regulatory requirements that are out there. Going out there in the Europe, obviously you have the GDPR that's out there, but thinking about those regulations that are out there and what you need to do and the cost to the company from that aspect of what could happen. And then there really is that they address, the concerns that are out there, the gap of security professionals that are out there being able to secure that. I can't count how many times every day I get emails that talks about, there's like X, job openings for cyber people. And why is all this important though? Because it really kind of comes down to what you can do to automate the process or secure that environment. Going back to the previous slide where we talked about, the weaker stolen credentials that are out there. And then again, just what can you really do to secure that environment that's out there, and making sure that you're doing that in your environment. And on the next chart here, I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on this, but it really is just a chart that has been created that really looks at across the globe of the different data privacy regulations that are out there. And this obviously continues to grow, and it kind of shows the dates that were out there. But you hear things about PCI, which is the payment card industry. You have HIPAA in the United States, you have GDPR. Even in the United States, we've had more from like California and New York, where they talk about California, I think it's the CCPA and the New York regs that are out there. You're continually getting more and more regulations that are out there in your environment, what you need to be able to secure in your environment. And this is not necessarily just, looking at it from a financial services aspect, but it really is, dealing with all these different companies, health care organizations, governments. When you think about all this information that is out there and the privacy that you want to make sure is secure in your environment, you really want to make sure that this information is secure and what you're doing, everything possibly from an authentication and protecting that data. And, it's not even, when you think about it, it's like even utility companies, energy utility companies that are out there in the environment, consumer products, retail, telecommunications, medias, travel. You know, there really isn't anything out there that is immune to where you want to look at this and make sure that you're protecting this appropriately. So, you know, a lot of times people come up, you know, so why, who cares? Why does this really have to do with the mainframe that's out there? And I know there's a lot of mainframe people that are on this conference is kind of geared towards some of this, but when you really think about this from that Z platform that is out there, is, you know, it is out there. It is out there being used all the time, whether it's hardware, software, the operating systems that are out there, and it continues to be that workhorse that's out there for, you know, the banks, the airlines, the governments, et cetera, as the statistics talk about here, you know, 44 of the top 50 banks, et cetera. But it really is critical to transform and make sure your business is up and running in your environment. And when you think about it, unlike the early days of it, you know, a lot of people thought about, you know, the mainframe was kind of on the sidelines. But when you think about what's happening today, and when you think about it, and we're going to talk about it in a couple more slides, is, you know, the interaction between the mainframe that's out there, whether it's mobile, social, you know, the cloud environments that are out there, it's really integrated as part of that. And when you think about what they're talking about, you know, a lot more customers are relying a lot more on the mainframe. They're putting a lot more things on that platform that's out there. And, you know, when they surveyed a lot of customers, 64% of the enterprises surveyed that more than half their critical applications are running on that platform that's up there. So when you really look at why is this important, because it really is about protecting that mainframe, protecting those critical assets that are out there in your environment. So when you think about, you know, securing that mainframe and protecting those, you know, there's various statistics that are out there, but a lot of them say, you know, the mainframes still hold like 80% of the world's business data that's out there. And, you know, whether it's, you know, banks, retailers, airlines, et cetera, a lot of those companies are really up there using that mainframe. So when you think about and I realize not a whole lot of people may have taken any flights anywhere recently, but, you know, the airlines that are out there, but you're probably doing banking, your health insurances, et cetera. But when you think about this, just from a mainframe aspect, is, you know, the mainframe hosts more transactions, processes more transactions than Google. And you see these numbers that are out here. So like, there's usually like 1.3 million CICS transactions per second versus significantly number less that is done via Google searches that are out there. And mainframes today still handle and do 90% of all credit card transactions. So again, you know, you're starting to see a lot more of this as the mainframe is secure, right? Who needs to worry? And when you think about it, there really is still that perception out there that that mainframe is that closed environment. It's contained in that cabinet, kind of like this picture shows. And it is the most secureable platform, but it is by no means secure. So you need to think about what you need to be doing. And the focus of all this is talking about what you need to be doing from an authentication standpoint and from protecting your data. When you think of this from the bad actor standpoint, the mainframe simply is just another server to be attacked that's out there. You know, but when you look at a lot of the statistics that are out there, the greatest threats are insider threats. Those bad actors won't be looking to target a system or application that's more likely to target individuals and attempt to steal your credentials. So as you think about, as your organization undergoes this digital transformation, or already is going through this digital transformation, you need to start thinking about what are you doing to secure that, making sure that that mainframe is that secure environment out there. You know, you need to be able to make these various devices that are out there available through your mainframe applications. But when you think about this, you know, the access management, the authentication that's out there is really critical to make sure that you're securing that environment that's out there. And that kind of leads into this slide right here. So when you think about it, the mainframe is more connected than ever. You know, when you look at a lot of these things in this chart, whether it's blockchain, mobile, unstructured data, Internet of Things, social, et cetera, you know, the mainframes are really more and more critical to that transformation that's out there and ensuring that you're really even the customer using things you're getting great customer experience that's out there. And when you think about this from that aspect, is one of the things you need to think about is user authentication and how it's changing rapidly that's out there. And when you look at this, there really is beginning this more of a vanishing perimeter, and really, all the cloud-based applications and the boundaries of what may happen. When you think about it, looking at even your smartphone or your tablet or anything else like that, think of the apps that you have out there, like maybe your banking app, or I have my airline app out there that I haven't had to use in a little bit of while. But thinking about all those that are probably connected or maybe doing something back into that mainframe environment. And the mainframe is secureable, and you need to make sure that you continue to have that level of security that's out there. So when you think about, again, the mainframes had a lot of history out there from that and securing it, but it's over 55 plus years old. What are you doing to make sure that that mainframe is securing in this rapidly changing world that's out there, and making sure that your applications are out there, they're secure, and that business workload is continuing as needed. And then we think about just all the internet applications that are out there distributed, and you think about, I've got the mainframe and I've got my distributed apps, and chances are that information is going back to the mainframe, getting offloaded into distributed apps. What am I doing even from a workload back office processing to make sure that information is secure in my environment? And again, just looking at that and making sure that your business is up and available and running. So I kind of wanted to walk into this as people start thinking about this, because as we start thinking a little bit more about, the key questions you need to be asking is, how do you prove that the person that's asking for access to those corporate resources is who they say they are? And when you think about, in order to decide who gets in, you need to start with the who. Identity really is that foundation of who you really are. And that's kind of where authentication comes into place. So when you or your system, you want access to a resource, the first question will focus on, who are you? And, when you think about a lot of it, have you ever gone out and Googled yourself? Your identity is public, and you kind of, can go out there and see some of that and make sure that claim of who you are is really something you have. And for the most part, when you look at the mainframe, it's usually a user ID, or maybe there's a digital certificate or something else involved. But it really is who am I? And then when you think about this, who I'm going to let in, that next step is authentication. Now that I've stated that identity to that system that's out there, now I need to make sure of how I'm really going to prove that it really is, in this example, like maybe Julie that's using some of this. So a lot of times today we think about it as, I've got a user ID and password that's out there. And, as we start looking into this more and more, this is kind of where multi-factor authentication kind of comes into place. And when you start thinking about this is multi-factor authentication, and we're spending a little bit more time talking about it, but in its simplest form, it's something you have, something you know, and something you are. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do you ensure users are who they are claiming to be. And this is just some interesting statistics that were out here from UBCO did some surveys on password and the state of authentication behaviors from 2019. And I realized the business aspect has changed a lot about this, but of these respondents, 63% say that they become more concerned about their privacy and security of their personal data over the last 2 years. And you think about what you've done, and especially now with everything that's going on, are you really doing a lot more to make sure, even from your personal aspect of what are you doing to make sure that you're keeping those privileged information secure in your environment? Whether it's credit card details, in the United States, it's like social security numbers, other numbers that you may have out in the world. And when you think about it, a lot of again, companies are looking more concerned about protecting that information. So you think about, I've got my health records in somewhere in a medical system. The company itself now is really looking to make sure that I'm protecting that information and making sure that that information is protected. And as you kind of seen, cyber attacks continue to become more and more prevalent all the time. That's out there. And again, we come back to that poor password policy or authentication practices that are out there. You know, what are you doing to make sure that you really are out there, who you say you are in your environment? And, you know, as an employee of companies, you know, are companies doing things to like test you for like a phishing attack, or do you get phishing attacks that are out there and, you know, you learn to, I've got to look at, maybe this is a URL, or have you gotten an email that says, oh, I need to get your user ID and password information. You need to be very well aware of what's happening in your environment. And one of the surprising things of this survey it talked about is it said nearly two-thirds of the people admit to sharing their passwords. So going back to a previous slide when I talked about how, you know, using the same password for maybe different accounts, you know, and you're sharing your passwords that out there, or, you know, continue to reuse your passwords. I don't have that problem because I can never remember my passwords. I'm always getting them reset because I'm always screwing up my passwords. So let's talk a little bit about this and talk about that authentication process that's out there. And if you go out here and research a lot of it, user ID and passwords are still the most common area that's out there. And this is why we need to start thinking about using multi-factor authentication in the environment. You know, you need to think about passwords, you know, you're using your personal email, or, you know, when you think about it, and over here in the United States, I was actually living in a state one time where your number on your driver's license was your social security number. And again, you can't do things like that anymore. You need to make sure you're protecting that. You think about, what am I doing from that aspect to control and secure that environment? What other options that are out there and available? You know, do you get like a text back to your phone to enter a number, or using like your fingerprints on your smartphones now to unlock them? That's out there. But again, kind of going back to is passwords are a relatively simple point of attack for hackers to exploit systems. And most systems do rely on passwords in some form to control various access that are out there. We all tend to use passwords or password patterns that are out there, but you really need to think about what you're doing to secure that authentication process in your environment and making it stronger to meet increasingly sophisticated threats that are out there. And especially when this goes back to the mainframe, which is, you know, historically been out there. And I've worked with a lot of customers where they have service accounts where they really do have passwords and they haven't changed in years. So, you know, so what are you really doing to make sure that that's secure in your environment? And when you think about this from an MFA standpoint, the mainframe is typically left out of this. I know I talked to a lot of customers, and they go, oh, you know, I got MFA out on the VPN or somewhere else. But going back to one of those earlier slides, it talked about the numbers of what it really takes from an insider threat. And as you're going to see, as we kind of continue on in a couple of slides, there's some interesting statistics that's out there. So when you think about this, and this is a study that IBM's X-Force did, you know, it really is, the passwords still really are a big problem that's out there, and you really need to be doing multi-factor authentication. And 80% of those initial entries into victims' networks were from previously stolen passwords. Going back to that theme I've been talking about is, what am I doing? Am I reusing my passwords that are out there? And when you think about this on the mainframe, without MFA today, you know, in general, I can use a password, I can use a password phrase, I can use certificates, I can do Kerberos. But when you think about password phrases has been out for well over 15 years. I can count the times in one hand, the customers that have gone out in these password phrases that are out there. And you've heard me say this over and over again. People tend to use common passwords, and they tend to use them on their same accounts. So if I have one in my work account, maybe my personal email, or going into my banking application, they all tend to be the same. But a recent study showed that 1 in 5 people were willing to sell their passwords. And in this study, it was determined that of that, people were willing to sell it for $20,000. And, you know, I've done this sometimes, or when I've done things and, you know, talking to customers, people will cycle through a list of passwords, right? So hopefully your password isn't January 1, February 2, March 3, or whatever, but they will cycle through that to kind of get back to something that is familiar in your environment. Writing them down, using special characters, numeric. How many times have you gone in and try to come up with that special password that's out there because it has to have uppercase, a special character, and something else that's out there, and thinking about, well, am I going to be able to remember that's out here? And depending what happens in your environment with your laptops, especially everybody working remotely now, do you have something that's, maybe doing a key logging out there? And of course, there's always just that good old brute force password cracking. It's out there. And when you think about it and just go out and Google some of these tools that are out there, it's amazing that ones that they can come out there and do that. So for the mainframe aspect, we've always had a lot of things that are out there, but more and more, you really need to think about what you're doing, and you really need to look at doing multi-factor authentication. So when you think about this, whether it's distributed or anything else like that, multi-factor solutions have the same definition that's out there. It's something such as a password, something you have, such as a phone or an ID badge, and something such as a fingerprint. And when you think about this, in order to be considered a valid multi-factor implementation, you need to have factors from 2 or more different factor types. Having 2 factors from the something does not count. That does not count as multi-factor authentication. And when you look at this, MFA is requiring simultaneous use of those authentication technologies from 2 or more of those categories to verify your identity. And when you look at this, again, we all talk about this as the something the something you have, and the something you are. Well, when you think about the something it really is that knowledge-based authentication. It relies on the user's possession of secret information. And again, the most common example really is that password that's out there. But you can also think of it could possibly be a PIN code or something else, or security questions that are out there. And then when you look at the something you have, this is really that possession-based authentication that's out there. And it relies on your physical possession of an object. So when you think about this and kind of in the picture that's out here, it could be those token codes, those hard token codes that are out there. A lot of this is given way more to the smartphones and or smart card authentication. So these are that something you have, which is that possession-based authentication that's out there. And then the something you are kind of fits into that biometric authentication that's out there. And it really is using that authentication technique, such as a fingerprint, facial recognition, voice identification. For the most part, with people using smartphones, it really is using like that fingerprint authentication that's out there. And as I mentioned before, multi-factor requires the use of 2 or more of those authentication types, or authentication techniques from at least 2 of those different ones. So you might want to combine that knowledge base and that possession base by requiring the user's password, but then maybe confirming it with that token code that's out there. Or you could do it with that fingerprint that's out there. And when I think a lot about what's happening right now, a lot of times is, I've got my I've got to use my fingerprint to unlock something, which is going to give me that token code to enter that's in there. But what isn't MFA? So when you think about it, from websites that require you only to confirm your identity using a password, but also answer security questions based on the information maybe appearing on the credit report, that's not MFA. It's going to provide some security, but it really doesn't achieve the process of what you need to do from an MFA aspect. This is more of what they call a 2-step process that's out there. And 2-step authentication really is, the second step is something that, I've received something via like an email or an SMS code, and then I got to go enter that in after I can maybe enter my user ID or password. And that really is, as using the same areas that's out there, but it is that 2-step process that's out there. Again, MFA requires the use of solutions from 2 or more categories that are out there looking at those multiple solutions. So a lot of it, we thought about authentication using MFA in that environment. The standard answer when you looked at this from a lot of customers. If you look back even as little as 5 years ago, it was like, it's my privileged users. And of course, when I went out and talked to a lot of customers, everybody had their own definition of privileged users. If they were a RACF shop, it was like, well, the people that have RACF system specials. But when you start really thinking about this, is you need to start, really what is that persona, that person that's out there in my environment, and who should be using it? Of course, my answer is basically everyone should be using it based on kind of what I've just walked through and talked through in my environment. But as you're looking at this in your environment, what about, do you have contractors? Do you have contract employees? When you think about contractor employees or contractors, have they been vetted through the same process as maybe your employees? Maybe, maybe not. What do you want to do from that aspect? You may want to make sure that they're definitely using MFA aspects that are out there. Look at suppliers that are out there. The same thing, when you look at this, who's getting into my environment, who's got the potential to log into my environment, why would I exclude them from possibly using MFA that's out there? I could have, suppliers could have access to inventory management systems. Why do I want to do that? Customers in general, maybe you just have customers that I'm out there doing a product or service. Maybe I want to make sure they're doing them. And again, that's kind of why this chart is up here. When you really think about it, you really probably want to have everybody, especially with all the threats that have been out there and the potentials that are out there, using MFA in your environment. And again, when you think about, to get to that front door, that authentication, I need to rely on the identity proofing of who that person is, who they say they are. And I want to make sure that that information really is who they say they are. So that's kind of where the multi-factor really kind of comes into play, is protecting your assets that are out there in your environment. And even if you look at some things, it may not be personal information, but maybe it's trade secrets. Maybe it's just research and development information that's going on. You need to make sure that that environment is secure from multi-factor authentication. And this kind of all goes back to, as we talked about, that first step of getting in there is all about that authentication. But then again, when you think about it even more, is I have to look at that from a data privacy and regulation compliance. So going back to that authentication, but continuing that on from a data aspect is, when you look at your environment and, the data really is the lifeblood of your business. It really is your company's most valuable asset. So even though you've got that authentication process, you need to find out then who's using it, how are they looking at it, and what are they doing with that information. And just to talk a little bit about some of the statistics, there's a lot of things that kind of come out there, and there's a cost of a data breach report that's out there and available. And when you look at that, again, 60% of data breaches are caused by negligent insiders that are out there. And when you look at the average cost of a data breach for a financial organization, it says it's 5.86 million, but again, depending on the customer, when you really look into some of those details, it could be a lot larger in your environment for that data breach that's out there. So you really need to think about, your security environments out there, what's happening, what do you need to do to be successful to protect that data that's out there, and how am I monitoring that? And a lot of customers really don't know where their sensitive data is in their environment. And when going back to those slides about all the regulations that are out there, it's about protecting that data. You need to make sure that you know where that data is and governing that data. And continuing based on that previous slide, is these averages are increasing, the number of records are increasing. These numbers were specifically picked up from the United States aspect, but data breaches continuing to happen. The time it takes to identify and contain a breach is getting longer. You need to think about how long it's taking. Some of the things that happened recently in the last several years, when you look at things when people's systems for 2 or 3 months, you need to go out and look and figure out what you're doing in your environment and making sure that you're doing everything. People got authenticated, but then again, I would need to make sure that they should maybe only be getting the data if I've gotten stolen credentials, am I getting some information that shouldn't be doing it? And in 2019, the average time to identify a breach was 206 days, a little over 6 months. And from there, it took another 73 days to contain it. So it basically took almost a better part of a year to make sure that you contain, identify that breach and contain that breach, and then what the cost is to your environment. And again, a lot of those breaches are happening from malicious cyber attacks. Going back to that multi-factor authentication that's out there, what are you doing to really secure it? And if you're not really doing anything to monitor the data, what are you going to be doing in your environment to protect your data in that environment? So when you really think about this, you need to be thinking about, your database files, your files that are out there, and think about your organization as a whole. What are you doing to protect that data that's out there? Do you have a single data protection infrastructure for it? Does it have the capability to monitor your environment that's out there? Can you prove that you really are doing what you need to be doing for security, privacy, and integrity of that critical data that's out there? And monitoring that information, and who's really looking holistically at that data across it, whether it's data on the mainframe or hybrid cloud environments or any other cloud environments that are out there like AWS, Oracle, Azure, etc. And you think about this, also you need to think about the capabilities from a data discovery and classification and vulnerability assessments. So how do I know that this, maybe this is data I need to be doing something with? It should be classified in a certain way, and who is getting at some of that data and activity file monitoring that's out there? What do I do? Have I got the capabilities of doing analytics or masking? One of the things I talk to a lot of customers about is, what's the best data to test with? Production data. And they copied into test environments. So again, looking at that, what are you doing to protect your data? And it really is, when you think about this, it really is everywhere. And it can be replicated. If I can read this data, I can copy it and take it somewhere else. And I used to, do you really want this data posted somewhere out on the internet? You need to make sure that that is secure. And kind of when you think about this is, just for a lot of customers, it's not so much a matter of if, or more of a matter of when. These are just some statistics that have been out there for a while. When you look at it from a data capability standpoint. So when you really think about this though, from a data standpoint, is a lot of times customers really have limited visibility, fragmented controls that are out there, reporting. How many times have you walked into a customer? I've walked into a customer, do you do any reporting? And they go, well, only if something breaks. Then we really kind of worry about if something's really happening in my environment. And it kind of goes to that bottom line is threats go and vulnerabilities go undetected. So what are you really doing looking at that data that's out there in your environment, kind of making sure that it is secure? And, when you think about it, what are you really doing from your privacy and going back to all that data compliance and regulatory management that's out there? How do you collect data? How do you process that data? Do you allow remote access? Now, granted, I know a lot of remote access is happening right now based on what's happening that's out there. What are you doing to secure that or monitor that data? You have a good idea where that data is coming from. Do you have vendors that process your data? And again, going back to that multi-factor authentication, or are you moving the data to the cloud that's out there? So start thinking about what you're doing in your environment to protect it. And you really need to think about that data-centric approach of where you're at. How do you identify data risks that are out there? How do you ensure that there's privacy out there? How do you monitor that information? How are you looking at it? How are you looking at it from a reporting aspect that's out there in your environment? So just kind of with that, talked a little bit about multi-factor, protecting your data in the environment that's out there, giving you some things to think about as I walk through this. I can't emphasize enough, you really should be doing multi-factor authentication. And when I really look at this is, you really need to look at this from, the globalization ecosystem that's out there, increased regulation and sensitivity that's out there. And again, emphasizing more than half of data breaches are caused by insider threats, compromised credentials, etc. And I kind of leave you with this chart that's out there as you talk to a lot of security information that's out here. This 152/92 is usually the blood pressure of a CISO when you think about all the things that are going on in their environments and their to-do lists that are out there. But again, just kind of really talking about it from an MFA viewpoint today and a data governance viewpoint in the environment. And with that, there are any questions, comments?
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, so does anybody, let's have a look. We have one. Let's have a look. So we have a kind of I guess a comment from Ian. He says, I remember way back when the internet was new, I came across a site which said if I enter my name, address, date of birth, etc., it could find a picture of me taken by law at the hospital soon after my birth. So I dutifully entered all the details. I was rewarded with a head and shoulders picture of a chimpanzee smiling at the camera and the assurance that the site would not use the detail for harm. I've always remembered that moment 25 years ago, and whenever I'm asked to enter my details into a form on the web on this day, to this day. And he says, thanks for an interesting presentation.
That's a great comment. That is awesome. I love that. Thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I have so like I said, everybody, just feel free to post questions. We can always unmute your line if you want to ask Julie a question directly. We've still got some time left, but I've got a question for you, Julie, about sort of the uptake of MFA these days for mainframe. I mean, I remember when we were at IBM together and it was kind of a very new product, and it's like all things that come into the mainframe world, it takes a while to catch on sometimes. And is MFA kind of still, is it growing in popularity, or is it kind of, are there still a lot of customers that are not doing it, adopting it, and they should be, or what's the kind of picture these days?
It is growing. And I think some of it's growing just because I think there's been a lot more, there's been a lot more discussion out there about the most secureable platform and why it's important. And of course, there's people out there talking about the pen testing that they do or something like that on the mainframe. So it is growing. It is still tough in some respects because there still is that mindset of I authenticated when I went in through my VPN, or I've got it in my distributed environment. I don't need it on the mainframe. But again, they just don't realize there's so many things that happen. It could happen in the environment, but it is growing more and more. There still is kind of that stigmatism about it's my privileged users. And again, what is your privileged user? Am I a bank teller that can access somebody's account? Well, that's a privileged user in my mind. And really, it should be, everybody's doing it.
Yeah, and you raise a good point there, like around the what is deemed as a privileged user these days, and I think some organisations really struggle with the definition of it. But I think the interesting thing, and it's been a while since I sort of read into sort of the intricacies of some of the regulations and things, but I'm sure it's things like PCI DSS these days mandates that you need to have an MFA solution in place. If you're going to for the cardholder environment, and maybe I've got that wrong, and I'm sure GDPR somewhere buried in there. I mean, we know some of these regulations are very sort of high level, but I'm sure buried in there somewhere it does stipulate that you need these solutions.
And it does, but it's interesting to kind of go in there and people's interpretation of them. Mm-hmm. And I'm probably going to get this wrong a little bit, but it's like, I don't remember which one it was, but if you really go in there, they kind of give definitions of what is considered it, kind of going back to that VPN. Well, just because you VPN'd in, when you got to that mainframe, if you're not doing it there, that's not considered, you haven't protected yourself from MFA. And I don't remember what standard it was in, or if it was one of the National Institute of the NIST publications that was out there, but really kind of went into a little bit more specific about, kind of as close to that data as possible that's out there. Yeah. So yeah, it is expanding. It's expanding more. And I think part of it also has happened though from you as a consumer, right? Think about 5 years ago, right? When you went out to your bank app or whatever, right? You put in a user ID and password. Well, now they're challenging you a lot more to do some different things that are out there. So, I mean, I think because for a while it was like, well, it's that user experience. We want to make it as simple as possible. But we as a consumer now, are getting more used to it because that's just what's happening from a consumer aspect.
Yes.
So it's happening.
I'd be interested from anyone in the audience, actually, if you've got any stories to share about how, if you've adopted MFA for the mainframe, how well it's been received, or any kind of lessons learned from it, and kind of how far you've got with it. So if anybody wants to share their story there, to like I said, just pop your name in the chat, and then I'll unmute your line for you. And this if you're brave enough, but please, we're a friendly bunch, so people are interested to hear of these stories. So if you'd like to share something,
I do love that story.
Yes, yes, it's great. Yeah. I mean, I just like I said, we'll just wait to see if anybody wants to post a question or come forward. But I mean, for me, I think it's, from where I've seen it adopted, you're absolutely right what you say, Julie. It's kind of, they start like, with the most obvious users, like your system specials, and the system programmers that are kind of deemed to be sort of the most powerful, accounts on the system, and they start at that point and let it bed in, and I have no doubt that over time that that the adoption rate will increase across the organization. But the other interesting thing is that there's a project that I've been working on where they're like onboarding applications to like a governance tool, and they're actually actively asking owners of those applications, do you have any privileged accounts that have got access to those applications? And and it's not just your typical, yeah, you've got Racket systems, special groups. What they mean by that question is, are there any screens that you have access to within the application that could affect the share price or something like that, or or maybe you can change the interest rate, so you could like set it to 0 or something like that. Those kind of privileges. So it's interesting how the industry is changing, and what we always kind of classically looked at as a privileged user is now really expanding across the sort of the business side. So
yeah, I mean, I always tell the story. In a previous job, I worked on a loan application, and we had a distributed system and the mainframe system, and the two didn't talk to each other. And literally, being an applications programmer, we had a test system. We could go do this, and the distributed system information would get uploaded on a nightly basis. The mainframe would get processed and kind of pushed back out in different channels. But literally, I had access to a distributed system where I could go create a loan. I was responsible for the process of the daily job that kind of did various loan activities. So I had the authority to create a loan. I could go into the program and write that loan off on a mainframe and send it back down to the distributed environment, and they would never have figured anything out, which kind of goes to that authentication, who's got access, and that data flow, what's happening with it.
Absolutely.
Not that I would ever thought of doing it, but it was like years later going, geez, I didn't realize the power that I had to do that.
Well, this is it, and it is that classic. If that user ID was compromised in some way, then yeah, and like you say, sort of MFA and a balance of other controls could sort of mitigate, help reduce that risk. So yeah. So any other final thoughts from anybody? See, we've got no additional questions in the chat.
Well, Jamie, thank you for giving me this time and opportunity to talk. It's been great talking to
thank you,
the GSE group.
Thank you, and we'll have you back again, Julie. Don't worry. And so yeah, so once again, Julie, thank you very much for an excellent session. So this is session 4 BG for the purpose of feedback. So do click on that link or go to the agenda and click on Julie's session. And if you scroll right down past the detail of the synopsis, you'll see the feedback link right at the bottom there, if you don't use that URL. And yeah, thank you, Julie, for that. The charity, so don't forget the charity that GSE has nominated this year. So we're really grateful. You can either click on the QR code that will take you directly to the Virgin Money giving website, and whatever you can afford, please do donate towards that. So this is the end of the first week of the conference. So we're giving you a day off tomorrow and the weekend. So there's no sessions tomorrow, but we're back for the second week of the conference, which starts on Monday. So there's a keynote that kicks off at 2 o'clock. That's 2 o'clock GMT. And that will be with Mark Wilson. And then there's a keynote session from Broadcom with the title of Opening Up Mainframe to Empower Digital Innovation. So that sounds really interesting. And then the main technical sessions, all the sessions start on Tuesday at 9 o'clock GMT. And again, all the sessions will be recorded. The first security session of the day will be on Tuesday at 10:30. And so hopefully you can join us for that. But yeah, do look at the agenda. You know, there's some really great content coming up. There's something for everybody, so take a look at that. But all is left for me to say is thanks for being a great audience. Thank you again to all of the presenters this week. I think that Zoom has done us proud, particularly on the security stream. It seems like it's been flawless. And a big shout out to Sue, Mrs. Parsons, who's been my co-pilot over the week, and she's been, you know, keeping an eye on the chat and things, and letting people in and so on, and kind of being my aide. Sorry, Sue. And also and also thanks to Gino, who's been actually monitoring all of the sessions and just keeping an eye on it and being our, you know, our technical support there. So thanks very much, Gino, for that. So enjoy the rest of the day. Have a well-deserved drink, and thanks for sticking with us. And we'll see you again next week. Thanks, everybody.